Welcome to E-Pathshala for Linguistics. We are going to talk about language acquisition in linguistics. The module name is Multilingualism and Adult Language Education. I am Shruti Sarkar, Professor in Linguistics, Department of Linguistics and Contemporary English, English and Foreign Languages, University, Hyderabad. The objective of the unit is to look at how children and adults learn language. We particularly look at adult second language acquisition with the intention of looking at the similarities and differences between first language acquisition and second language acquisition with special reference to adults. We look at the points where they are similar and the points where they are different. So the unit will give a comprehensive view of how languages are learned in the mind. We know that children learn language very fast and without any difficulty. By the time they are 4 years old, they have basic mastery of the sounds of the language, the rule patterns of the sounds, words, and how words combine into sentences. How do they do these things in such a short time without anybody teaching them anything? Parents do not correct children for their mistakes, but still they learn the language. But adults, in contrast, are very different. They need a lot of instruction and a lot of exposure, and they take a longer time to learn the language. Sometimes they learn it, but not with such accuracy like a 5-year-old does in the first language. In this unit, what we are trying to do is to look at language learning in adults. But let me first tell you that there are certain terms that are used together and they sometimes mean the same things. For example, when we talk about second language acquisition and bilingualism, in a country like India, it is bilingual, in fact it is multilingual. But when we talk about bilingualism and multilingualism, we are talking about the product of language learning, how much children or adults achieve after the process of language learning. But in second language acquisition, we are not interested so much in the product, whether a person knows 2 languages, 3 languages or 4 languages, but we are interested in how the second language is being learned. So in this unit, we will look at 3 important things. One is first language acquisition, that is when children learn it from their childhood. Second language acquisition, when children learn it. Second language acquisition, when adults learn it. In the first part, we talk about the types of first language acquisition. First language acquisition is a term that we use to refer to any language learning from infancy. That is, what a child learns as the first language after it is born. This process starts at birth and continues till lifetime, but a basic amount of language learning is learned by the time the child is 5 years old. Second language acquisition, in contrast, is a term that we use when we refer to any language that is learned after learning the first language. Please note that we are saying after the first language is learned. It could be the second language, it could be the third language, it could be the fourth language. It doesn't matter. It still comes within the rubric of second language acquisition. Because here we are interested in how the mind acquires a second language. A third term that we use is bilingual acquisition. Because in bilingual acquisition, a child is learning 2 or more languages from infancy at the same time. So it is different from first language acquisition, because when we talk about first language acquisition, we are talking about 1 language. When we are talking about bilingual acquisition, we are talking about 2 or 3 languages learned simultaneously. In second language acquisition, we are talking about learning of any other language after a first language or languages have been learned. So the contrast in this unit is between two things. One is that first language is normally learned in a naturalistic context. That is, when people speak to you, when you're communicating with a child, when the child is communicating back with you, and there is no classroom formal teaching. Whereas in second language situation, there is a lot of learning which is happening within the classroom as well. So there is a formal part of the instruction as well as the naturalistic. There's another term that we use interchangeably sometimes with a difference. Let me talk about that first. We talk about foreign language teaching or foreign language learning versus second language teaching or second language learning. Here, as I have said earlier, for us the matter is that of learning any language after the first language has been learned. But however, people do make a difference between foreign language learning and second language learning. And this is particularly with reference to the context in which the second language or the foreign language is being learned. For example, in India, English is learned as a second language, whereas French would be learned as a foreign language. The difference here is that within the classroom, a child learns French, but there is no context of use of French outside the classroom. Therefore, it is restricted to the classroom. Whereas in the second language situation, the language is available within the classroom as well as outside in the community. Now we look at the points of difference between first and second language. But before that, let me talk about what are the points of interest for a linguist who is looking at language acquisition. Because our primary goal in this unit is to look at the linguistic system and how the mind acquires the system. The first thing is, how does the mind acquire another language? Because we all agree that we can live a complete life with just one language. Learning a second language is not necessary for the mind and its cognitive activities. Whereas a second language is something that is available across the world. There are fewer communities which are monolingual, and much more people who are bilingual or multilingual. The second point of interest is, if there are two systems, linguistic system, that is the first language and the second language in the mind, do they interact? And if they interact, is there any effect of age and maturation on the learning? Do they interfere with each other? Does learning become difficult when you are older? These are some of the issues that we are looking at. Let us look at adult language education, because this is an area which is more important to us and more pertinent to us than second language acquisition in children. Because in children, what happens is they are cognitively more flexible and it's easier for them to learn the language. But as an adult, we have already learned a language in its full entirety, and then we are learning another language. Two major findings which have been documented over years in adult language education is that it is highly systematic and it is highly variable. Now this would look contradictory in the first glance. Highly systematic, highly variable, but this is a fact. It is highly systematic because the way we learn the language, the route that we use, that is what is learned first, what is learned second, what is learned third, what is the order of learning, is universally attested. That is, all adults seem to learn languages exactly in the same way. That is, the route that they follow is the same. Whether they learn French, whether they learn English, whether they learn Bengali, whether they learn Russian, it is the same across. Whereas, another attested fact is that adults do not learn language in the same way. In the same way, in the sense that the output is very different. Some learn it better, some are struggling with it, some do not learn it at all. So the output is very variable. And this is because the rate at which people are learning language is very different. So we are putting together two interesting facts here in language acquisition, that is the root and the rate of language learning. And this is very different in adults because the root is the same like first language, whereas the rate is very different from first language. So what is the similarity that we are talking about? Let's look at the root first. And we try to find out whether there is evidence in language learning that the root is the same. Two very well documented facts in language acquisition is that it is highly systematic and it's highly variable. It might look contradictory at the beginning. At one glance, how can something be highly systematic and highly variable? The systematicity is in the way in which language is being learned. That is, what is being learned first, what is being learned second, and how is it being learned over a period of time, the route that one follows in language acquisition. Later we show in the unit that this route is very similar to first language acquisition. Whereas the rate at which adults are learning, some learn it faster, some take a longer time, some never learn. So the rate of language learning is very different across adults, and therefore the output is also variable. We show that the root is very similar, right? And how do we show this? We show it with two very well-known facts in language acquisition is how are grammatical morphemes learned, and that all learning shows a U-shaped learning curve. Let us look at the grammatical morphemes. Morphemes is a term that we use to indicate a smallest unit of meaning that grammar has. For example, when I say sleeping, sleeping has two parts, sleep and ing. Ing is a morpheme for us, sleep is another morpheme for us. So we are trying to look at how these ing, ed for past tense, plural s, possessive s, in what order are they learned? Roger Brown in 1973 first documented on the basis of three children, Adele, Sarah and Eve, the acquisition of these morphemes, whether there was an attested order. And he looked at 13 morphemes and he found a very clear order. Take a look at the slide. You'll find that present progressive, that is ing, is learned first, followed by the preposition in and on, followed by plural, and then followed by the past irregular, that is the went, then possessive, and finally you will find that past regulars and other things are learned. And all children show the same pattern in English. This was replicated by another person called Dewey and Bird in 1973 to show that second language children follow almost the same route, that they learn these morphemes in the same order. With some variation, but statistically it was the similar order. Krashen in 1977 did the same study on adults, and he actually broke these 13 morphemes into 3 boxes. And each box has a set of morpheme, and once the first box was acquired, then the second box could be acquired, then the third box could be acquired. So which shows that first language and adult language acquisition follows the same route. Look at slide for Krashen's natural order hypothesis. The second point which indicates the similarity between first language and adult language acquisition is what we call the U-shaped learning curve. Let me take an instance. Take the word speak. The present tense of the word is speak, so I can say I speak every day at 10 o'clock for 15 minutes, which is absurd, but still possible in terms of a tense. I spoke would be the past tense. I spoke for 15 minutes at 10:30 yesterday. Between speak and spoke, children take a slightly longer time to understand that spoke is the past tense of speak. Initially, when they start learning, they treat speak and spoke as two separate words in the language with no connection between them. So there is no connection of one being a past tense of the other. So they use it correctly in the right place, in the right way. Spoke for the past tense, speak for the present tense, but they do not know that spoke is the past tense of speak. So there is 100% accuracy in the use. Whereas, by the time children realize that there is a connection between the present and the past is usually coded with ed, they then realize that speak should also have an ed. So you get the word speaked. So the child would say, I speaked yesterday, which would be an error. So immediately from 100% accuracy, you see a drop. And if you imagine on a statistical graph, you will find a drop. And then what happens is they realize that yes, speaked is the past tense, but no adult uses speaked. And there is another word, spoke, for it. So he has to learn to block the ed rule, which he has learned for other things, which works for other things like stop, stopped, walked, walked, talked, talked. So he has to block that rule and use a new word in its place. But he knows now, unlike the first stage, that speak and spoke are related as a past tense. So again, the accuracy goes up to 100%. So if you look at the graph, notice the graph on the slide now, and you will find that this is not only true of past tense, it is true of plurals, it is true of adjectives, and this is something it is attested in child language acquisition as well as second language and adult language acquisition. So we have 2 points that we have shown. One is the acquisition of grammatical morphemes and the U-shaped learning curve, where we clearly see that first language and adult language acquisition are absolutely similar in terms of the root of language that they follow. We spoke about the similarities of first and second language acquisition. Now let us look at whether there are differences. We all know that 2 people learning English in India will speak very differently. And their knowledge of rules, their knowledge of words, their knowledge of when to use what would be very, very different. Then if L1 and L2 are similar, then where do these differences come from? They come from one of the 5 factors that we are going to look at. One is age, the second is the initial state of grammar, the third is interlanguage, fourth is a distinction between acquisition and learning, fifth is affective filter. Let us look at the first. As we started the unit, we said that children acquire a language with complete mastery, and they are able to use the language accurately in all contexts without making any errors. But that's not true of adult language acquisition. Adults may learn the language completely, have complete mastery over the language, but this is a very, very rare phenomenon. There is always scope where there are errors, where adults do not know the right constructions or make mistakes with constructions. One of the things that we know is that age plays a major role in language acquisition. If I'm a child and I'm learning a second language, I do much better in the language than if I start learning the language after I'm 16, 17 years old. So foreign language in that matter becomes a little more difficult than child second language. Lenneberg, 1967, first put out this hypothesis that there is a critical period for language learning. So there is a period when the mind is sensitive and flexible, and language learning becomes very easy if we start learning the language at that period. But it has been shown over a period of time with a lot of research that this sensitivity is particularly to the sounds of the language, but it does not really affect grammar of a language. However, we still kind of believe that there is a period when language learning is much better if it is within 1 to 8 years or 1 to 7 years, the period of the sensitivity is something that is seriously debatable. But we do agree that there is the sensitive window when language learning is much easier. The second issue is, unlike a child who is learning the first language and the notion that there is something called a language, adults already have one language, therefore they already know what are the things that are possible in a language. And therefore, that is something that they have already available. So there is an initial state of grammar which they have, and then they are learning another grammar. So one of the features that Noam Chomsky in 1956 put forth is that language learning is very different from any other learning, and therefore there is a specific module in the brain which helps us to learn a language, which is called the universal grammar. The question that we are asking, or people have asked, is children use universal grammar to learn a language. Do adults also have access to the universal grammar when they are learning a second language? So there are multiple kinds of theorizations that are available in the literature now. Some people believe that once you have used the universal grammar, the possibility of using it again does not arise, and therefore adults have to depend on other domain general abilities to learn language. This is called the no-access hypothesis. On the contrary, there are people who believe that universal grammar is available for first language, second language, third language, fourth language. So it is completely available for all language learning, and therefore adults can also learn a language without any difficulty. So the mind has no difficulty learning a second language. This is called the full access hypothesis. Then you have a middle point where people say some parts of the universal grammar are available, some are not available, and therefore adults find it difficult to attain mastery like a child, because those parts which are not available would be difficult and they would take a longer time to learn that language. So that is one point of difference, because there is no existent grammar in the mind of the child, whereas there is an existent grammar in the mind of the adults, which might create a problem. So we come to the third point, which is called the interlanguage. Now, when a person is learning a second language, the person has available the rules of the first language, and he is learning the rules of the second language. Now, what happens between these two? So what the person uses initially, are they like the first language, or are they like the second language, or are they totally different? They are neither like the first language nor like the second language. Let's take an instance. For example, if you take Hindi and I want to form a question, I will have the word kya in exactly the same position where the questioned element is. So I say, usne kya khaya? Usne seb khaya. So kya is sitting at the position of seb. So we don't need to move kya. But in English, we have to say, what was he eating? So what comes in the front of the phrase, the clause, and you have to move the what to the front. I cannot say, he ate what? That would be ungrammatical. But apart from this, what we find is that in English, we have to also invert the auxiliary and the subject. That is, I have to say, what did John eat? I cannot say, what John eat. So even if I move, I have to change the place of the did and John, or the verb and John there. Now, what happens in second language acquisition, particularly in adults, you will find sentences like, do you know where my friend is? Or this would be the right thing, but they would say, do you know where is my friend? So they don't change structures in this way. So the rule that they are positing is neither like the L1 nor like the L2, which means that it is between these two languages, and this is what we call the interlanguage. It is neither like L1 nor like L2, it is somewhere in between, and therefore it is called the interlanguage. Now the interlanguage error which is neither like L1 error nor like L2 error, could be because we are transferring some elements of L1 and transferring some elements of L2, or it is because there are two rules possible in L1, L2, and I have learned only one rule and I am overgeneralizing that rule. So the errors could be interlingual. The fourth point where adult language education acquisition differs from first language acquisition is the distinction between acquisition and learning. Krashen in 1982 first pointed this out, that acquisition and learning are two different forms of language learning. That is, acquisition is where we are picking up rules without being conscious of these rules. So it's an unconscious form of learning. This is like child picking up rules of grammar. Nobody teaches them, they are not aware. If you ask them what is this rule, they are not able to tell you the rule, but they know exactly how to use it. So it's something that they have acquired naturally and unconsciously. Whereas learned rule is what you learn in a classroom situation, where somebody tells you that you cannot use two negatives in the same place. So you cannot say, I did not eat no mangoes. So we are told explicit or given explicit rules. So this explicit conscious rule system and the acquired rule system are two different kinds of systems that exist in the mind, and learning grammar explicitly does not translate into an ability to speak and write. So the adult language actually stores two separate rule systems. One is the learned system, the other is the acquired system. And the learned system does not become the acquired system. But there is a role of the learned system. If I have the time, if I have the rule, I can correct myself because I know explicitly what rules should be used. So it acts as a monitor. So it monitors our outputs. Let's imagine that I have written a paragraph, and 5 minutes later I revise the paragraph. I'm able to use my learned system to correct it. But when I wrote, I used my acquired system. So I have the time to correct it now. Take a look at the diagram that is given for you. So the monitor acts only when the rule is available, when we have the time to correct our the product of our acquired system. The last point that we make is that between the adult and the child, there is a big difference of what we call the affective filter. The child learns a language, but child has absolutely no attitudes towards learning the language. So it doesn't matter whether he likes the language or not. It doesn't matter whether he is motivated to learn the language or not. It doesn't matter whether he is anxious to learn the language or not. These features of attitude, motivation, anxiety, confidence, personality type does not affect a child's learning of the language. Whereas these are very important factors in the learning of a second language, the adult language particularly. If I think that English is a language which is useful for me, I will have a good attitude towards the language and therefore I will learn it better. But this has absolutely no effect on the child who is learning his or her first language. His or first language, learning his or her first language is not a choice. It happens. But in adult language, language learning is kind of a choice. We make that choice most of the time. And we learn the language. And that seems to have an impact on the way we learn the language. So what we have done now is we have looked at the differences between first language and adult language acquisition, and we have pointed out that age plays a role, the initial grammar, what is in the mind already plays a role, the kind of systems of interference plays a role, motivations play a role, that is affective factor, and the difference between acquired and learned system also has a role to play. So in this unit, we have brought out the difference particularly between first language acquisition, that is when a child is learning a language, and second language acquisition, particularly when the adult is learning a language. So there are a lot of differences between a child and an adult and their cognitive abilities, and we have shown that there are points of similarity, that is the route which they follow in learning a language, whereas the rate at which one learns a language is very different in adults. The rate has implications because what we know earlier about the language, how old we are, how motivated we are towards learning the language, how are we learning the language, whether we are using our conscious system or our unconscious system, all these seem to affect an adult's learning of language, and that each adult behaves differently in the output of learning, how much they have learned of the language. But these do not affect first language. However, in one simple statement, we have shown in this unit that the root of language learning is universal across any language acquisition, whether it is child language, first language, second language, adult language, or bilingual acquisition, but the rate is always variable.